in world pop. Welcome to part 2 of World Trends in Population. We once again have our HAS member, Gary Morris, to come talk to us about this. Just a little bit of background on Gary. I think you all know him because he's a regular speaker here, but he has a bachelor's in economics, a master's in artificial intelligence, a PhD in machine learning, and for the last 10 years of his federal career, he was the chief of the IRS Artificial Intelligence Committee. So I will turn it over to Gary.
I'll tell you, the more I see people dealing with combination Zoom and in person and multiple screens and everything else, the more I'm convinced that they're all geniuses and I'm a dunce. The real advantage of being a HAS presenter, of course, is you get to take your mask off. Okay. I believe we're already, come on, there we go. Okay, we're going to be picking up where we left off last week and talking about the implications of the population decline, which I hope last week I convinced you is going to happen. You'll probably hear me say more than once, I hate Windows. Is there any way I can get rid of that green bar at the bottom? I guess not. Okay. How? Oh, is that the more?
Yeah, more. And then hide something. Go up, hide floating media controls. One more.
There we go. Okay. All right. Well, just quickly summarize last time, I told you about the Malthusian hypothesis, which in brief is that humanity is doomed to breed itself into starvation. We mentioned the fact that in Malthus' day, there were 1 billion people on this planet, and now there's 7.8 billion, and mass starvation hasn't happened yet. The 20th century turned out to be the primary example of explosive population growth, and we claimed that that growth was enabled by several dramatic changes, namely the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, urbanization, and modern medicine. One thing we introduced that I'm going to remind you of today is the demographic transition model. That's the model you see here on the right that has 5 different stages. And as you'll recall, in stage 1, that's most of human history. But stage 2 and stage 3 are when all of a sudden populations began to explode because the death rate dropped. People quit dying so early, but the birth rate didn't. Stage 4 represents stasis again, where the birth and death rates are roughly equal. But stage 5 was the great insight of Mr. Thompson, and that is that populations that start to decline will continue to decline. We introduced some key terms, the birth rate and the death rate. As you'll recall, those are both how many people are born or die in 1 year. And then the fertility rate, which is how many children a woman has over her lifetime. And the replacement rate, what keeps population stable, is when that number is 2.1. So modern demographers have identified 4 factors that are causing this decline in fertility: urbanization, birth control technology, education of women, and decline of religious influence. So what we concluded last time was that there are some conflicting projections. The UN Population Division, which I claim is a somewhat political organization, claims that we will have 9 billion people by mid-century and 11 billion people on this planet by 2100. Now, they're assuming high fertility rates in a lot of nations where already it's dropping pretty rapidly. As I said, I think that some of their projections are politically motivated, but if they are right, and if climate change is not restrained, then the Malthusian hypothesis, a couple of centuries after he made it, might turn out to be right. But I don't think so. Academic demographers say, yes, we are going to approach 9 billion people by mid-century, but after that, the global population is going to decline rather dramatically. And by 2100, we'll be down to 7 billion people. That's fewer people than we have on the planet right now. Now, if that's the case, starvation is averted. And furthermore, the academics believe that continuing reductions in global population will increase, will go on well beyond 2100 for the foreseeable future. So after last Wednesday's lecture, I ran across this headline on Friday. This was in The Economist, a British newspaper that I monitor, and it's all about China. You'll notice that they're showing that the population in China is becoming older and older. That's the dark blue at the top of the left graph. In the middle, you'll find that they're showing graphically just how effective the one-child policy was. But when they tried to reverse that with the 2 children and 3 children policies, made no difference. I think the most interesting is the graph on the right, which shows that they are approaching the case in China where live births will actually be less than abortions. That is unprecedented. Okay, so today we're now going to talk about the implications of population decline, and that's where I think the most interesting topics come up. First, we're going to explain why it is that nations are so fearful about population decline, and they are. We're going to do a case study of the US Social Security system. We'll talk about migration, and then we'll get to my favorite topic, automation and robotics, and their possible role in rescuing us from demographic problems, and then we'll reach conclusions. Why is it that nations fear population decline? Well, let's think about this. What nation does the US consider to be its largest rival? And why is that? Anyone? Who do we pardon? China, sure. Why is that, do you think? Well, China is a pretty large country geographically, but then again, so is Antarctica. I don't think we're worried about them. No, the answer is it's not the wealth of the Chinese people. It's not the size of the Chinese military, which is much smaller than ours. It's not even their technological prowess or leadership. Yes, China is making great strides in technology, but they're still playing catch up. Size matters, and I mean population size. China's huge population makes them the world's largest market for, you name it, cars, cell phones, clothing, almost anything you want to name. Everybody in the world wants to sell into the Chinese market because it's the biggest market. Now, the government of China, by controlling access to that Chinese market, has tremendous political and economic leverage. Until very recently, the rule was no company could come into China and manufacture or sell unless a Chinese entity owned 51% of that company. And guess what? All the technology that they brought with them was absorbed by their Chinese partners. The only exception to that rule was Tesla. They wanted Tesla so badly that they waived that rule. But still, for the most part, China is in the process of trying to steal as much technology as they can. And they have the leverage to do it. Now, a large population doesn't always involve a large military, but it gives you the potential for a large military should you need it. I said that the problem was not China's wealth. The US, as you'll see, has a per capita gross domestic product of 65,000. China's is only 10,000. Luxembourg, 114,000. Now tell me, is anybody afraid of Luxembourg? No, size matters. And it's the size of their population, not its wealth, not its military, that gives China the role of our #1 nemesis. So let's talk about China. As you'll recall, that they were fearing overpopulation about 70 years ago. And so they instituted a one-child policy for 30 years. And fertility was forced to drop, as you saw in that graph. More importantly, the cultural norms for family size changed. And that's something that you don't turn on and off with a switch. Now, of course, China has seen the folly of what they did. They instituted a two-child policy several years ago, and just this year announced a three-child policy. And as you saw in that graph, they have not moved the needle at all. Fertility is still low and dropping. And in fact, many academic demographers believe that the reported fertility rate, which is well below 2.1, is even being fudged high, that it's lower than they're willing to admit. China is afraid, deathly afraid, of declining population. So why is it? Well, because there are a lot of advantages to a large population. One of them is you can have big crowds for your parades, but much more importantly, with a large population, you have military power, you have economic strength, you have a large tax base, that is, you have a lot of resources that can be commanded by the central government, and you have geopolitical power and influence, as we've mentioned. Now, in order to explore this a little bit more in detail, we're going to have to introduce some more key terms. We're going to talk about the dependency ratio. That's the ratio of children and retirees who supposedly are not contributing resources, their ratio to working age people, the workforce, or at least the potential workforce. So the dependency ratio is the ratio of all the people who are depending on the workers to the workers themselves. Expressed as a formula, we say that the dependency ratio is equal to the sum of children and adults divided by the number of potential workers and times 100, just to make it a ratio. So children are defined as anyone from age 0 to 14. The aged are ages 65 plus. We can all be offended by that. And the working population is considered to be those between 15 and 64. Now you can break that dependency ratio into its two obvious components. There's the child dependency ratio, which is the number of children compared to the number of workers. And then there's the aged dependency ratio, which is the number of aged or retirees compared to the number of workers. Now, the child dependency ratio is going to be high whenever the fertility rate is high, right? Because we're producing lots of children and they become dependents. But just 15 years later, those kids become workers. And that lowers both the child dependency ratio and the age dependency ratio. But 65 years after their birth, lots of kids becomes lots of seniors. And when the boomers leave the workforce, both the age dependency ratio and the child dependency ratio are going to go up. And they're going to go up quite a bit. That's where the United States is today. Let's remember this demographic transition model. Now, the claim is that developed nations are all now in stage 5. Now, when you had a growing population, you had future increases in the benefits of a large population. You can look ahead to all of the wonderful things that were awaiting you when your population got bigger. When you have a growing population, you have a low age dependency ratio, and you have a growing workforce. And as the children become workers, you get built-in economic growth because new households are being formed. And those kids need everything from bed sheets to cars. Now, admittedly, children cost money, but they cost a whole lot less than retirees because we have to have our own separate houses, our separate cars, and especially medical care. Now, all of this is referred to normally as the demographic dividend. When you have a young, growing population, just by the sheer dynamics of the demographic, you have a lot of advantages. So it's a dividend. But when you have a declining population, you're getting a slow loss of all those benefits. Now, the death rate that's the blue line on this stage 5, the death rate can only get so low, but there's no limit on how low the fertility rate can go. Every generation is going to be smaller than the preceding one, which means you're always going to have a high age dependency ratio and a shrinking workforce. And with fewer children entering the workforce, economic growth slows because fewer households are being formed. And those costs of supporting retirees are significant. Not only the separate housing and the cars, but let's face it, medical care for us is much, much more expensive than it is for children or people in their middle years. This is referred to as the demographic drag. When you have a declining population and an aging population, it's just a drag on the economy. Now, some of you may be thinking, wait a minute, I'm a retiree and I'm not dependent on anyone. I've got my 401k. Well, in money terms, retirees are indeed self-supporting. We have investments, we have Social Security, we have all kinds of things that we've bought and paid for. So in money terms, no, we're not dependent. But in terms of goods and services, I mean, the American economy has to produce every day everything that everyone needs. Well, who produces all those goods and services? It's not children and it's not retirees. It's only the workers. So in terms of goods and services, indeed, both the aged and children are dependent on the workforce to produce everything they need. Now, the IRAs and the Social Security payments and so on that we receive are financial structures. They determine how big my slice of the pie is, my slice of the goods and services, compared to your slice. But financial structures don't produce the pie. Only current workers can produce the pie. Now, that's why everyone has a real big stake in worker productivity, because only worker productivity determines how big the pie is. When the pie gets a lot bigger, we're all better off. Now, you may have seen this graph before. It's a fairly famous one. It's how many workers are supporting one Social Security retiree. And this is from the Social Security Administration. Now, back in 1945, when a lot of people still had not qualified for Social Security benefits, and when virtually everybody was working, Rosie the Riveter and everyone else trying to make war goods, there were almost 42 people working for every retiree. Well, as you can see, that dropped off pretty quickly. By the time you get to 2010, that's only 2.9 workers supporting each retiree. And that was before all of the boomers started to retire, because the boomers, the very earliest ones, didn't hit age 65 until 2010. So let's take a look at this US Social Security system. Now, Social Security is often referred to as an insurance program or an investment program or a savings program. It was introduced during the Depression to address the problem of impoverished seniors. And it's not a savings program. It's not an insurance program. It's a social welfare program, because any actuary who looked at Social Security structure would say, this is a scam, shut it down. It is not in any way an actuarially sound insurance program. The reason is that Social Security benefits are being paid out of the taxes being collected that very same year from workers. So in a sense, I don't mean this too harshly, in a sense, it is a, what do they call it, a pyramid scheme? A Ponzi scheme, thank you. It is a Ponzi scheme, but it's a government sanctioned, in fact, a government invented Ponzi scheme. The taxes paid by workers provide the Social Security checks for you and me. Now, the only reason that there is a trust fund, and there is a big one, is because this system really got going after World War II, when there were a lot of baby boomers coming up, and those baby boomers became workers, and they were paying into the system a whole lot more than any retirees were drawing out. So there was an excess, which was invested. in US Treasury securities. So the government was loaning money to itself. But now that we boomers are retiring, the trust fund is going to be exhausted. Every year, Social Security Administration issues a new projection as to which year the trust fund will go away. And that keeps getting closer. It's not getting farther away. Social Security is in trouble because politicians make poor demographers. That's not me, that's a quote. This has often been called the Grey Tsunami because the boomers, that's us, produced a large demographic dividend through the 20th century. And the 20th century was a century of amazing growth and development. There was a large increase in the workforce, and that lowered the dependency ratios, both of them. Household formation spurred even more economic growth. The house building industry boomed. There were more workers per retiree in the 20th century. But beginning in 2010, they became seniors in record numbers, and now we have a large demographic drag. Now, this is just the beginning of a big shift from workers to the aged. Now, it's going to continue through 2030 when the last of the boomers reach age 65. So for at least the next 10 years, the aged dependency ratio, which is already getting fairly high, is going to continue to grow. There are going to be fewer workers per retiree. And there's also going to be a demand for ever more expensive medical care. This is going to be a drag on the entire economy because today's workers have to produce all the resources to pay for that medical care. I imagine everybody in this room is probably like me. You've got good medical insurance and scared to death to think what would happen if you didn't. And occasionally you see the bill that got paid by Medicare or Spectrum or whoever, and it's enough to make your knees shake. The cost of medical care is not going down. Every time a new miracle cure comes up, it is heralded as wonderful news, but it turns out to be, what, $1 million a year or more to keep someone alive. That cost of medical care is a drag on the entire economy because that money has to come from somewhere. Now, let me stop at this point and say, are there any comments or questions? Susan has a roving microphone here that you should use so that people on Zoom can hear the questions. Anybody in the classroom have a question or a comment? Over here. We're going to make you run back and forth.
Sorry about this.
That's okay.
We have a number of people congregating in our southern border, wanting to come in and obviously become producers. But we don't seem to want them to. Can you comment on that?
The question was, and I still have to repeat the question, right? The question was, we seem to have a lot of people on our southern border who would like to come into the country and become workers. Will I comment on that? Thank you very much. That's our next topic. I'll pay you later. Anyone else have a question or a comment?
So we have a couple, Gary, on Zoom. George
Okay.
Richter, I see that you are unmuted. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Okay, when you commented about the demographics in China, I believe the age of working in China has historically been very young. As late as 1992, the first time I went to China, the typical workshop was filled with 14 and 15-year-olds. And now the move in China is for millions to have an advanced education, which means they're not entering the workforce until they're 22 or 23 for thousands and millions of young people. And the age of retirement is the same, only worse also, because it's historically been 55 for women and 60 for men. And they're, so the the drag of the new economy is much more than the standard ages you outlined for the Chinese. So therefore, the fear of population decline and empowerment is probably even greater than they will like to talk about.
Those are good observations. And there's more to it than that even, because even though the GDP per capita in China is still fairly low compared to the developed world, nonetheless, these are people that a generation or two ago were living in abject poverty, and now they've risen into the lower elements of what we would call the middle class. What happens when families start to rise into the middle class? They want better things for their children. So they don't want their children to work in a sweatshop. They want their children to go to school. So yeah, there are a lot of forces that are changing the workforce in China. Good comment. We have one here in the classroom.
So Japan has a much older population. Is that what we are going to look like? Yeah. Or maybe not too long distance?
Yeah, as you'll recall, the quote last week was, Japan got rich before it got old. China won't be so lucky. A lot of people worry that the United States could end up like Japan, but I'm going to talk about some reasons why I don't think that's going to happen, or at least not going to happen as severely as it did to Japan. But that's a good observation. Any other questions, comments? Okay, let's go on. And let's talk about migration, as the gentleman has requested. Now, internal migration is something that you don't often think about. But in fact, internal migration is every bit as big a factor in demographics as migration between countries. Now, it doesn't immediately affect the population size, but urban families have a much lower fertility rate than rural ones. We talked about this last week. When a family moves to the city, the dynamics change. You go from extra farm hands to extra mouths to feed, and that changes a lot. The urban-rural mix in this country and in the world is going to flip in a single century. In 1950, 30% of the world lived in cities. In 2007, we reached the tipping point where 51% of the world was urban. And all the projections are that by 2050, 2/3 of the world is going to live in cities. Now, that has already proven true in the United States. And this is yet another factor that's driving down fertility rates and contributing to population decline. This map, I think, is the most stunning statement about urbanization in the United States I've ever seen. Most people who look at this say, no, that can't be right. The red areas are tiny. That's more people than the whole rest of the map? Yep, it's true. America is an urbanized nation. If you look at this map, you can probably start to pick out which large metropolitan areas they're talking about. Of course, all of Southern California is red, but you'll notice that the mid-Atlantic coast, New York, Boston, Washington, those are all red. Look on Michigan. You'll notice that the Detroit area and Grand Rapids are red. The entire rest of the state is gray. You can see Chicago there, and if you're real good at geography, you can probably identify more. But we are an urban nation, largely. And all those statements about what happens to fertility when you become urbanized hold for us in spades. Now, as I said last time, for global population, migration's a wash. It's ignored because moving from one country to another country doesn't change the global population a bit. But when you start talking about population dynamics in any one particular country, migration becomes a very significant element. Migration, in the view of demographers, is what they call push-pull migration. That is, migration almost always involves people being pushed out of low opportunity areas and being pulled by the allure of high opportunity areas. And certainly our current situation with people trying to flee oppressive regimes or failed states in South America, trying to get to the United States, classic example. Very low opportunities in some of those southern countries, and obviously very high opportunities here. So when you talk about immigration, what does that evoke in most people's minds? Maybe somebody building a fence to keep those silly migrants out. I think recently that has been the image that came to most people's mind. But Latinos on the southern border are only the most recent example of immigration in this country. Previously and now in a new wave, refugees from Afghanistan have been a significant immigration factor. I don't know about you folks, our church was involved in sponsoring an Afghanistan family that was fleeing the Taliban 5 years ago. Amazing people. Boy, what that one family has contributed to our community is enough to make me embarrassed. Hardworking people determined that they're going to take advantage of the opportunities in America. Hey, but they weren't the first. Who built the railroads in this country? Primarily Chinese laborers. And although they were needed and essential for the railroad building, they were discriminated against and treated poorly in almost every other circumstance. They were immigrants. We wanted nothing to do with them. Well, and before that, it was the Irish who fled to America during the potato famine and were considered to be almost subhuman. There are lots of examples from East Coast newspapers with help wanted ads that would say, no Irish need apply. They just weren't considered to be very good people. Everyone knew they were drunks and brawlers. And before that, well, the Germans. When America was still colonies and just becoming a nation, the influx of German immigrants was very significant. In fact, late in the 18th century, the brand new US Congress actually took a vote on what should be the official language of the United States. German lost by 1 vote. And I suppose I should mention that the Dutch were also immigrants. And I understand that they had some attitudes too, but we won't go into that. So what about migration? A couple of big surprises. One of them is that even though it has made the headlines for the last 5 years, migration has basically been stable in the United States for decades. Most immigration in this country is legal, not illegal. In fact, from 2008 to 2018, in a 10-year period, more people migrated out of the United States to return to Latin America than the reverse. But I'll bet you didn't read about that in the newspaper. The demographic impact of migration is significant. Immigrants tend to be young, and so they lower the average age of the host country. And that's a good thing in terms of trying to oppose population decline. It also means that you're getting young workers that are going to be in the workforce for quite a while. Now, immigrants tend to bring their fertility rate with them, but only for 1 generation. But nonetheless, when people from high fertility countries come to this country, they tend to have more children than Native Americans do, or I should say, the non-immigrant population, however you say that. They have more kids than we do, but that only lasts for 1 generation because those kids absorb the American culture. Very importantly, immigrants provide a constant source of workers for jobs that we consider less desirable and that don't pay very well. But they will do them and do them well because they are trying to live the American dream. All developed nations have native fertility rates, that is, fertility rates of the non-immigrant population that are way below the replacement rate of 2.1. Look at this graph. These are all developed nations, many of them European, but not all of them. The highest one on the list is France, 1.87, well below 2.1. US is at 1.7, Canada below 1.5. Look at Puerto Rico. Does that match your image of Puerto Rico? The US and Canada are the only two nations that do not face a projected significant population decline in the 21st century. Why? Immigration. In a nation with a growing senior class, immigrants can soften the impact of the increasing age dependency ratio. Not only that, but immigrants bring new perspectives, new ideas. They universally have a positive impact on the economy. Immigrants make the host nation richer. In 2016, 7 Americans received the Nobel Prize, and 6 of them were immigrants. What else do you have to say? 44% of the Fortune 500 companies, that's 220 companies, founded by immigrants or their children. You may recognize some of these. These are not small enterprises. Every one of these founded by an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. These are companies that have changed our nation for the better. You may not agree concerning Amazon, but you have to agree concerning SpaceX. And I didn't put Tesla on the list because Elon founded both of them. The Canadian strategy is very heavy on immigration. That is a conscious government policy. 20% of Canada's current population was foreign born, and that population is growing because the government wants it to. In Toronto, 50% of all the citizens are foreign born. Some have called that Trump's unintentional gift to Trudeau, because when it became the perception that America was anti-immigrant, the city of Toronto and the government of Canada both launched extensive advertising campaigns in Europe and Asia saying, America doesn't want you, we do. Toronto is quickly becoming the Silicon Valley of Canada. Canada's immigration flow per capita is triple the United States. In other words, per citizen, they welcome 3 times as many foreign-born as we do. But Canada and the US are both leaders in accepting immigration. So in Canada, the population is aging, but it's aging more slowly than in any other developed nation for that one reason. Immigration is their secret weapon against the age dependency ratio. Now, it can't overcome it, but it can certainly ease the transition. It can soften the blow. It can make the demographic drag much less severe. So, problem solved? No. Immigration softens the blow in North America, and in fact, the US and Canada are going to be stronger than almost any other developed nations because of immigration in the 21st century. We are going to be able to withstand these demographic forces and maintain a healthy and a leading economy because of immigration. But the demographic reality is that we're still going to have a high age of dependency rate for many years. So, are we doomed to stagnation? Is the demographic drag going to eventually get to us? Well, I would like to argue that one reason that it won't is because of automation and robotics. What are the problems of an aging society? Well, we don't have enough young workers to do entry-level jobs. Have you gone to McDonald's recently? There are too few workers producing goods and paying taxes out of the whole population. And there are not enough caregivers for the elderly. And worst of all, workers eventually become retirees. But what are the capabilities of our mechanical friends? Well, they are, quote, willing to do repetitive, boring, low-level work all day long. And they never complain and they never join unions. They are excellent at producing goods, although currently they're not paying any taxes, but they still are doing a good job of replacing human workers in terms of productivity. In terms of caregivers for the elderly, we already have chatbots, we have robo-dogs, hospital orderlies, tireless companions that are being used in nursing homes in the United States. That trend was started in Japan, which of course has a much older population, and it's transporting here very well. But best of all, when a robot no longer is useful as a worker, it doesn't retire. You just throw it in a scrap heap. Now, I have an absolutely wonderful video showing what robots can do, produced by Boston Dynamics, and we tried for half an hour this morning. We cannot get it to run. So if I can remember how it is, I'm going to show you a few segments. Okay, and I have to do a new screen share, don't I? Okay, new share. This one. Okay. Let me show you Atlas. This is a robot built by Boston Dynamics. Boston Dynamics was originally an independent research organization. See, and I once again have to make that bar go away. They were originally a privately funded research organization. They did some stunning work, and Google decided to buy them. Google owned them for 4 or 5 years and recently sold the company to, you'll never guess, Hyundai, the Korean auto manufacturer. You can interpret that any way you like. But now if we can get the thing to run. I don't know what I did. This is Atlas. There is a light soundtrack to this recording that you can hear in the background, but there's nothing significant. This is their most advanced two-legged humanoid robot, if you will. Now, Boston Dynamics is strictly focused on replicating human mobility. They aren't too worried about making him look like a human. They're not too worried about any other human capabilities. They just want to deal with this amazing thing that we all take for granted, being able to walk around on 2 legs. Notice that Atlas is going over rough ground in the snow. And he slips and he slides, but he's able to recover quickly enough that he doesn't lose his balance. His hands have a gripper attached. Now, this is Boston, so the human is using a hockey stick. I don't know if we should be too concerned about the fact that he doesn't want to get too close to this guy, especially while he's behaving like a jerk. Well, this is to demonstrate what I think is a pretty amazing capability. All the robot knows is that it's suddenly on its face.
The 60 minutes to the piece on this too. Very similar to
There are lots of videos from Boston Dynamics, and they're all pretty stunning. I had another one about stretch. This is a different robot. Notice that it's not bipedal. This is on a mobile base that has wheels. That's how they unpack their cartons of new robots. That large thing up on what you might think of as his head, that's a suction gripper. And that head is really just a very long arm. Mating dance? I don't know. This one is rolling into a shipping container and hauling out cartons. The other guy is bringing his conveyor belt with him. Okay, I think you get the message, so I'm going to stop this. And go back. And I think I have to do
an urgent message. To anyone with type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes, this discovery could save your life.
That is not part of our presentation. Yes, and I'm trying to make sure that I'm now sharing the right screen. Oh, come on, Ellie. And once again, hide the floating controls. Okay, well, this was the beginning of the video that I wish I could have shown you, but you will recognize that the one that I did show you was part of that. So robots can do lots of things with bipedal or with warehouse operations, but as you know, they're good at lots of other things too. This is a scene from, I believe, an American automobile manufacturer where robots are welding and assembling cars. They can also work on very small electronic. Oh dear. Did I do something wrong? Oh, okay. They can also work on electronics and do very delicate operations. This is a headline from about 2 weeks ago. This was in MIT's Technology Review, and they were pointing out that it's not just a demonstration anymore. A new generation of very capable robots are literally taking over warehouses. One of the major forces in this, of course, is Amazon, which experienced explosive growth during the pandemic and had to staff their warehouses at a time when getting human workers was very difficult. And they were a large enough company, they could just go out and say, we need robots that can do this, this, and this, and they got them built. And it's now something that's going on in a whole lot more than just Amazon. Robots can also do things like surgery. This is the Da Vinci system, which has been around for a while. Robotic surgery able to make very small incisions and do surgeries that have much shorter recovery times. Now, of course, if you want robotic surgery, you've got to go to a major medical center far away, like Zealand. This was 2 days ago, a headline in Technology Review. DeepMind is an AI research firm in London that is owned by Google, or owned by Alphabet, which owns Google. And they decided to take on the problem of predicting weather very, very precisely, because there are a lot of businesses that really need to know, is it going to rain in the next 90 minutes? And if so, where? They built a deep learning system that is able to do better than any human forecaster or any other system known in predicting when and where rain will occur in England in a 90-minute window. Well, with robots able to do all of this stuff, do we want to work? Why do humans work? Well, one clever fellow put a bumper sticker on his car explaining why he was going to work. And although it makes for a great cartoon, I don't think that's really why we work. After all, how many of the people that founded these Fortune 500 companies took their billions in profits, went off to a Caribbean island, kicked back and retired? Answer, not one. They don't need money anymore, but they still need to work. Why? Well, why do so many HASP members spend hours and hours and hours preparing 75-minute lectures for exactly the stipend that I'm getting? Why can hospitals and libraries and churches and schools get large parts of their work done by volunteers for free? Work is purposeful activity, and human beings need purpose. It's what drives us. It's what gets us up in the morning. Even if robots eventually can perform nearly all economic tasks, humans will not be idled. We may be doing rather esoteric things, but they will be because we have a purpose, because we want to do those things, or we feel that those things are needed by our fellow man. However, when we're off doing esoteric things like hospital volunteering, we're not getting paid, and therefore taxable employment has declined. Now, that may not be a problem for us, but it is a big problem for the government. Furthermore, the standard work week has been changing continually for the last 100 years. During the agricultural era, any of you that grew up on a farm know that what the standard work week was. It was 7 days a week as long as you're awake. And if we catch you loafing, we will deal with it. My father used to have a practice. If I went out on Friday night, the later I stayed out, the earlier he got me up on Saturday morning. And there was always work to be done. But during the Industrial Revolution, 60 to 80-hour work weeks were common. But in 1938, admittedly during the Depression, Congress enacted a 44-hour week. This was considered revolutionary. The whole idea was to spread the work available over more workers. And a few years later, they changed that to the 40-hour work week, which is still nominally what we have. But guess what? 20 years ago in France, they mandated a 35-hour week. 20 years ago, I was at University of Pennsylvania, and I was working on a Vicky scholarship. My wonderful wife got a job at the university to help put me through. And the standard work week at UPenn, 35 hours. Spain, the Netherlands, France, Iceland, and Microsoft Japan are now all working on a 32-hour week. And surprisingly, a lot of studies have shown that they're getting as much productivity out of their workers in a 32-hour week as they used to get out of 40, which implies that those coffee breaks were a little bit longer than we thought. The trend is clear. The only question is, where's it going to end? Well, maybe this is where it's going to end. Maybe. I think everybody in this room recognizes Star Trek. next generation. What is it that you never saw in a Star Trek episode? Money. There was no such thing as working for wages in Star Trek. If you needed anything, you went to a replicator and said, Earl Grey tea, hot. And it appeared. Well, that was perhaps a bit of magical, but nonetheless, in a Star Trek economy, there was still a society with meaningful work. There was a meritocracy all the way from the captain down to what? Will, the intern. There were still hierarchical organizations, and humans had a purpose, but physical abundance was provided by technology, not by human sweat. Money was just not used. Now, is a Star Trek economy possible? Technologically, at some date, absolutely. There is no reason why physical abundance cannot be completely supplied by machines and robots, not by humans. Well, that no money part may never happen, but that's because of human psychology. But no matter how long it takes to get to that Star Trek economy, no matter how close we get, there are some difficult transitions that we have to navigate, and they're starting now. For example, robots and Social Security. How does that all work? Robots and taxes, or what some people have called the importance of being unimportant. This is what I'd like to talk about last, and it's among my favorite topics. You'll remember this slide showing how many workers were supporting every retiree. And this was ending in 2010. Well, let me show you a different one. This is a, whoops, first some text. If only human workers are supporting retirees, then if the population gets smaller and the age of dependency ratio gets larger, the problem's going to keep getting continually worse. But if robots and humans both support Social Security recipients, then the declining number of human workers can be offset simply by increasing automation. Here's a slide that I prepared from various sources, Social Security Administration and national economic data. This is the goods and services produced per retiree over the same period of time shown in the previous slide. And you'll notice that this is not a dramatic decline. This, in fact, shows an improvement from the 60s and 70s up to the current era. Compare these two slides. From 1960 to 2010, the direction is very different. So, human workers and their machines, in fact, produced all the goods and services necessary to support retirees and, in fact, workers and children as of 2010. Now, there was a slight decline in 2020 due to increased retirees, economic headwinds, not to mention a pandemic. But it's clearly true that humans and their robotic friends can produce all that we need to support everyone. But Social Security is not supported by goods and services. It's supported by taxes on human workers. This may not look like your pay stub, but this is a typical pay stub showing all the deductions that come out of someone's wages. And among the largest are FICA, which is Social Security tax, not to mention Medicare. Machines and AI systems, robots, they don't get pay stubs and they don't pay taxes. Now, this is such a glaring problem that Bill Gates, who is certainly not an enemy of automation, has said robots have got to pay taxes. The problem is, how do you define what's a robot? And once you do, how do you tax it? Look at these images. Which of those would you say is a robot? You probably wouldn't say a drone is. Roomba? I guess that's a robot. What about that self-driving autonomous taxi down in the lower right-hand corner? Is that a robot? Okay, well, if it is, how do you tax it? And certainly the Martian rover isn't going to come back to Earth to pay any taxes. One proposal that has been forwarded, and I admit I'm a big fan of this, is a way to solve the problem with a value-added tax, or a VAT. Now, in a value-added tax, a producer adds value to a product. The producer combines or processes inputs to produce an output that is then sold. If you're an auto manufacturer, you take cars and steel and aluminum and batteries and all that, you put them together, and out comes a product you can sell for a sale price. Now, with a 5% VAT, a producer's tax is 5% of the sale price of that car minus the tax that was paid on all the inputs. So if suppliers produced the engine, the battery, the seats, and so on, they all paid a value-added tax on their output, and the auto company gets to subtract the tax already paid from the 5% that's due on the total price of the car. Now, of course, that means that the tax on the inputs was less than the tax on the output because the inputs cost less than the output. Otherwise, the guy's not making any money. And of course, the auto manufacturer has to pay all of its workers. And the tax on the value that they created is not collected until the 5% tax is calculated on the sale price of the car. Now, this is not a tax on profits. A company always sells its products for more than the cost of the inputs. Nobody's that stupid. Now, you can lose money for other reasons, like you've got high startup costs, or you've got debt service, or heavy R&D investment. There are a lot of reasons why a company can lose money, but it's never that they decided to sell their product for less than it cost them to make it. So it's not a tax on profits. It's a tax on the value of what you've produced minus a tax paid on all of your inputs. Now, the tax is not added onto the sale price. It's built into the sale price. So the automaker doesn't get to say, here's your new Ford, and there's a 5% tax on top of that. No, they say, here's your new Ford, here's what you paid for it. And then Ford has to pay 5% of that sale price. Now, there are industries that don't have any inputs. An extractor of resources from the earth, like a mining company, or a producer with no other inputs, like, say, a consultant. They have to pay the tax on the total sale price because no tax has been paid on any of their inputs. There are no inputs. But everybody pays tax on what they sell, whether it's an intangible product or whether it's an automobile. Now, there are a number of advantages to a value-added tax. One is that all purchases include the VAT. But if instead of spending your money on stuff, you're saving it or investing it, there's no tax on that. So this is a tax on consumption, not on investment. Many economists say that that's a very desirable feature. Now, the VAT is computed on total sale price, whether the product was made by humans, robots, or both. Therefore, if Ford decides to replace some humans with some machines, the VAT collected does not decrease. So in effect, there's a tax on what the humans contributed to that Ford, but there's also a tax on what the robots contributed. In effect, the robots are now being taxed equally with humans. Now, if a VAT were to replace the Social Security tax, workers' take-home would be increased because they're no longer paying Social Security tax. So presumably, in a fair world, they would then have enough extra money to pay the higher prices that are caused by manufacturers having to charge that 5% VAT. Now, I say workers. Those making more than $142,800 per year have a cap on the amount of Social Security tax that they pay. But I'm not too worried about those folks. Now, there are some more advantages to a VAT. One is you don't have to define what a robot is. How the product is made doesn't matter. It can be made by a robot that looked like those videos we saw. It can be made by a machine that looks like nothing you've ever seen. It can be made by a computer algorithm. Doesn't matter. However the product is made, it's taxed at full value. Another advantage is that foreign-made goods have zero VAT prepaid. So sourcing your inputs from a foreign source all of a sudden has a disadvantage because you don't get any credit for VAT previously paid on that input. That's going to make foreign sourced goods, in this case, 5% more expensive than the same product produced domestically. VAT is not exactly a weird new idea. 140 nations on this globe have already value-added taxes. Now, some people have suggested that a value-added tax ought to be a great replacement for the income tax. None of those 140 countries have ever abolished their income tax because they have a VAT. A VAT taxes a different part of the economy. They still tax your incomes. But there are some good models out there about how to structure a VAT, how to administer it. And in fact, Michigan had something that they called a value-added tax for 30 years. This is not something new. Now, there are a few disadvantages of a value-added tax. One of them, that it certainly is to Americans, it's going to be new and unfamiliar. And a more important one is that people who are living on their savings or a pension or investment income, they don't get any extra take-home pay to offset the higher prices that are caused by the value-added tax. That's a problem that has to be solved in the administration and implementation of a VAT. It can be solved, but it takes a special effort. So I would argue that a value-added tax is a way to make robots pay taxes. And I would argue that increasingly that's going to be important because more and more robots are going to be producing the physical goods and services that we consume. There's another factor at work here, and it's called the importance of being unimportant. As automation and robots and AI do more and more work, human workers will eventually do only those things that automation can't do. And that's going to be a steadily shrinking amount of tasks. But nonetheless, the humans in an organization will be doing the tasks that cannot be automated, which means that we humans will be the few, but the essential. Not that many of us, but without us, the whole system doesn't work. Some would say that makes us the few, the proud, the Marines. I prefer the few, the proud, the tenors. But anyway, in many industries, the cost of human workers is going to become very small compared to the total cost. Now, when that happens, you get a phenomenon that was studied back in the 20th century with airline pilots. A couple of economists were really curious about the fact that wages weren't going up all that fast in the 60s and the 70s, although they were improving, but airline pilots were making out like bandits. And they said, why? What is it about airline pilots that makes them able to win these very large paychecks and steady increases? So they did a study. What they concluded was the secret of success for the airline pilots was the cost of the pilot is a tiny proportion of the total cost of running an airline. You got to have departure gates. You got to have people at those gates. You got to have the cost of the airline, the airplane itself, and all the various machines that service it and fuel and all that. The pilot was a tiny component of their costs. But without the pilot, you aren't going anywhere. They were few, but they were essential. So they had a lot of bargaining power when it came to negotiate their next pay package with United Airlines. Well, yeah, I'm asking for a lot of money, but if you don't like it, that's fine. We'll just wait until you're ready. Airline pilots were making out like pirates. I would argue that that is the situation that we are moving toward if we, in fact, have a more and more automated economy. Humans will be few but essential, which means that humans are going to be a small part of the total cost structure, and paying us a little bit more isn't really going to sink the company. Now, I'm admittedly the office optimist, but I think that this bodes well for how humans can make out in a mixed economy where robots are a large and growing part of the workforce. So, some conclusions. Perhaps some of you are scratching your heads and say, how did we get from demographics to tax policy? Well, remember, we concluded that academic demographers, as opposed to the United Nations, forecast that we're likely going to avoid a Malthusian catastrophe and the world population is going to decline from 9 billion in 2050 to only 7 billion by the century's end. And nations are afraid of population decline for very good reasons, because size matters, because they won't have as many resources to command. And they're worried about that high age dependency ratio and a shrinking workforce. The demographic drag is something truly to be feared by national government. Now, all developed nations, and even some developing ones, as we said last week, have native-born fertility rates below 2.1, and their populations are going down. We talked about the fact that immigration can partially mitigate the speed and the impacts of population decline, and the length of the work week, has been shrinking, and it's going to continue shrinking, but humans will continue to work because we need purpose. And automation and robotics is going to do more and more of the production of goods and services. Now, that means that as the age dependency ratio grows, the number of human workers supporting age retiree shrinks, but the number of humans and robots can be much more stable. So, since robots don't pay taxes, we're going to have to change things like Social Security, but one solution is the value-added tax. The ultimate result could be a Star Trek economy. The US and Canada may be in the best position of any developed nation to deal with declining population because of our secret weapon, immigration. The brain drain of the rest of the world can be a brain gain for us. Now, if North America can maintain its position of leadership in technology and maintain its beneficial immigration policies, our future can be bright. So, as the optimist, I say we don't have to fear it. We can, in fact, profit from it. Any other questions or comments? We have a question over here.
This is going back to the robotic thing. I don't think in your model, robots are going to replace creatures. And so, where does my money come from? Because I'm not going to do it for nothing.
The question is, in my videos about robots, we didn't show any robot priests or preachers. And they're not likely, in fact, to become robots anytime soon. So who's going to pay the preacher's salary? Well, that's something that I have not thought about and haven't researched, but my shoot from the hip answer is religious organizations and indeed civic organizations like HASP will continue to be supported by humans only. And humans, if I am correct, will be in a position to negotiate rather cushy salaries for the essential work that we do. And therefore, we will be able to tithe and pay your salary. That's my hopeful response.
Gary, I have a question in the chat. And it is from George. Why make the assumption that the SS tax is removed if a VAT, excuse me, if a VAT is added? Many EU countries have a sort of straight up social tax on employment. It can range in different countries from 10 to 25% of wages. It funded what we call Social Security, unemployment, sick leave, vacation pay, maternity leave, etc.
Okay. I don't have to repeat that because that was a Zoom question. I will admit that replacing Social Security taxes with a VAT is my proposal, is what I'm advocating. It's certainly not the only way it could be used. The reason that I advocate for a VAT as a replacement just to Social Security is because it deals with the problem of how do you tax robots. That's where I'm coming from. Yes, many other European countries have different approaches to it. They use VATs for different things. This is my proposal for how you tax robots.
Thank you. Also, Lori Gosshorn is in Zoom and has her hand raised. Lori, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I once read a short story and I don't recall the name of it nor the author, but in it, there was a society that was pretty much all robots doing the work. And if you were a young family starting out, you were given the task of utilizing and using up and eating as much as possible and living in these large houses and having lots and lots of robots to do all the different tasks. And if you were an older person, retired or wealthy, you were allowed to live in a smaller home and not have robots doing this, that, and the next thing, and being decidedly forced to, not being forced to wear out clothing, to eat extensive amounts of foods and so forth. And that story has stuck with me for many different reasons over the years. But as you talk more about robots filling roles more and more and more, this story just jumped to my mind, and I guess it sends a shiver down my spine just thinking about what the possibility of a world where robots are relied upon so heavily and who take over a lot of the tasks that many of us knew how to do, know how to do, and aren't learning how to do in the newer generations and so forth. It's just, I guess, more of a comment than necessarily a question, but if you have any response, I'd be interested in hearing. Thank you.
I don't recall what story you're talking about, but I am a big sci-fi fan. And as many of you probably know, science fiction writers have spent a lot of ink talking about a future in which humans and robots coexist. Some of them have a rather optimistic viewpoint and some don't. You can make up any story you want about what's going to happen in the future and argue then about the implications. Isaac Asimov, a pretty bright biophysicist from Brown University who happened to write a few books, had a whole series called the iRobot series, in which he talked about it. And his speculation was that eventually there would be, in his view, there were lots of planets that have been colonized. His view was that some planets would say, we're going to let the robots do everything and we'll just all live like the masters of society. Other planets would say, we're scared of robots. We're not going to allow them on our planet. We'll do everything the old-fashioned way. Thank you very much. And he argued that both of those were overreactions, and that in Asimov's view, humans had to learn how to live cooperatively with robots. And he made some great stories about that. That's the only comment I have, but I would welcome any other comments people want to offer.
George Bo Richter has his hand raised on Zoom. Go ahead, George. Unmute yourself. Thanks.
I think when we talk about robots, robots are used not just to perform a physical task because the task is too hard for a human to do, or it's repetitive work like unloading and loading pallets from a truck. But most of the robots that I think that are used in industrial tasks today are used because the robots can do a job better and more precisely than a human hand can. And that's, you use the illustration of the Da Vinci robot.
Mhm.
But I know in our experience, we use them because we can't have people take two pieces and apply a simple bead of glue to one side or the other, and to put the two pieces together nearly as well as we can have a robot put a bead of glue around the inside, then pick up the arm of with a robot, the second piece, and put it into a fixture with the first piece, and exactly make the glue and exactly squeeze it out, and do it all day long and all night long, and not have a whole bunch of them that we got to take apart and re-glue because somebody oozed the glue out too fast or too slow, or pushed too hard on one corner or the other corner. So the robot can do what people can't do. And I think that's a big reason that we're going to continue to see robots, is because the society has become increasingly more precise on the technology side of existence and life. The automated factory is around. You can find them in West Michigan. There are factories that run dark, and they shoot injection molded parts all night long, and there's not any lights in the building. And if something goes wrong, a light goes on and somebody goes over there and fixes it. But they can make the parts better. It's not just that they can make parts when there's nobody working, they can actually make the parts right.
An excellent point. And I suppose a companion point to that is that robots are also able to perform dangerous tasks that humans either can't or we really don't want them to. Such as-
Fukushima.
Beg
They're
your pardon?
working in Fukushima right now.
Yeah, yeah. Robots are not affected as much by radiation. They're not affected by smoke inhalation. And the truth is, if you send a robot in to do a dangerous task and it gets crushed, well, you're out a couple $1,000s, but that's a whole lot better than losing a life. Excellent point. Any other comments? We have two here in the classroom.
Talk about the advantage of immigrants and added so much to our economy. Right, but is there any factor of whether legal or illegal? What difference does that make?
The question was, I talked about the contributions of immigrants, but is there any distinction between the contributions of legal versus illegal immigrants? That's a little out of my depth, but my personal observation is that illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants in the American economy tend to perform the low-level jobs. There are certain parts of agriculture in this country that if you cut off all illegal immigration, they would have no way of harvesting their crops. Legal immigration tends to bring in people with higher education levels. It's not always true, but on average. So I would say that one distinction between the legals and the illegals is that the illegals get the grunt work and get the low wages and are scared to death to interact with the government for fear they're going to be deported. Whether that's good or bad is a political question, but as an economic question, the illegals are what keep large parts of our economy going. Admittedly, something I didn't show you was a recent headline in MIT Technology Review about grape picking in Italy. Italian winemakers are finding that even with a flow of immigrants, they can't get enough people to pick grapes. And so they have developed robots that can actually pick grapes without harming them and harvest them for winemaking. That was driven not because they couldn't get people to do it right. It's because they couldn't get people at all. Question up here.
Is there a case study for Japan with regard to robots and being able to provide for their senior citizen population income or transfer payments?
The question is, have there been any case studies of Japan's situation with regard to robots caring for the elderly? Yeah, there have been lots of studies because a lot of scholars think that Japan is just kind of showing where the rest of the world's going. Japan has pioneered many aspects of human care robotics. The conclusion that I've seen, and I've certainly not read most of that literature, but what literature I have read is that robots can make a contribution. They're not the whole answer, but robots that are able to be companions, that can respond to voice commands, that can remember what meds you take when, that can call for help if all of a sudden the person is non-responsive or falls or something like that. Those are all good things. They can't take the place of human relationship, but they can certainly help.
I have a question. With climate change and its impact on poorer countries, and so immigration is just a much bigger deal. As people move out of countries that can't, for whatever reason, aren't handling or dealing with the climate change issue. So countries, or developed countries, are going to have to, instead of overreacting about immigration and so forth, they're going to have to get a lot smarter about it because it's going to become a larger problem over time.
I certainly agree that it's going to become a larger problem over time. Oh, do I need to repeat that for Zoom? I guess I do. His comment was that with climate change affecting less developed countries in severe ways, people fleeing those effects of climate change are going to create a much larger immigration issue than we have now. How are we going to deal with that? If you want to run for the European Parliament, I think you could probably make a case that you're right on the biggest issue they're dealing with. Europe is much closer to most of those nations that are going to be negatively impacted than we are. And Europe is struggling with how to handle immigration caused not because people are fleeing a war, but because people are fleeing a failed economy or the effects of climate change. I'm the office optimist. I like to believe that, as Winston Churchill says, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities. I would like to think that when we get done, sticking our heads in the sand, that we are going to use our technological prowess to come up with ways to affordably suck carbon out of the atmosphere, that we're going to rapidly decarbonize our economy, and that the technologies that we developed can be shared with the rest of the world, and that hopefully we can avoid the worst impacts. But yeah, clearly some things like sea level rise and increased severe weather are already with us. They're not going to go away anytime soon. And they are going to cause immigration problems, mostly not for the US, because our biggest immigration problems come from Central and South America. And those nations are probably going to have less impact from climate change than Asian. But excellent question. Any other comments here or out there?
Nothing else in Zoom, Gary.
Well, amazingly, it's exactly 11 o'clock.
It is.
So thank you all for your attention. Go thou and encourage your kids to, well, anyway.
Thank you.
Gary?
Yes,
Hi, do you mind one more question?
sure, fire.
I don't know